that third division.
Well, hey, Kai, thanks for coming along and giving your time to the Brisbane Stoics. We can check out what you're up to and what you're about and your work.
Thank you, Courtney. I'm really, really grateful to be here. Very grateful to have people in the group in Brisbane interested in my work and Leo's work. And yeah, it's just a real privilege to be able to talk to your group, to be able to read, meeting of the minds as we came on. I said, it's just wonderful to think of people, when the people read Being Better, they are thinking some of the things that you were thinking. And, the audience is also important when it comes to, when we're writing the second book, we're asking a lot of, questions to the audience when I work with Simon Drew. So we have a very participatory approach, and the kind of questions that people ask then sort of come into being, as it were, in some of the answers that we're providing in the second book. So it's kind of really nice now to have the community also feedback directly and indirectly. That's really wonderful. So if anybody has any comments, that's always welcome, because it will go into the way that we address some of the people's concerns in the second book, hopefully.
Oh, great. So, yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about that book? Is it Being Better, Stoicism for a World Worth Living In?
Yeah, so that's book one and the only book so far. But yes, and Being Better is interesting. I think it's interesting because it's not really self-help, or it's certainly not mere self-help. So the idea of being better is to make yourself better, to make the world better, your family better, your community better, your tribe, as it were, better. That could be a geographical tribe, as it were, or it could be a online tribe. So like the Stoic community, I always think of as my tribe, a tribe that is not something that's geographically attached to me in any way, but really is seeking, or most people in the tribe are seeking what I'm also seeking. So Being Better was really sort of throwing down the gauntlet and saying, okay, we want you to be better people, we want you to do the right thing, but it's not only about you. So we'd say things like, it's not very Stoic to have the expression, put yourself in my shoes. Because if I try to put myself in your shoes, Courtney, I think you're probably taller than me and bigger than me. So if I put my feet in your shoes, my feet will just slosh around. And if you put your feet in my shoes, they'll get scrunched up. So in the book, we're like, the best person to answer your questions is you. But we can ask you the questions to help you think through the kind of things that you might have to consider when you face a certain obstacle. So that's you'll find that quite innovative, but it's actually Epictetus' discourses the whole way through the style, not the method. We're saying it's Rufus is always asking questions, discourses being the after hours class, not the formal lessons, but okay, what do you think about that? Why do you think that way? Why do you believe what you do? That's what really Being Better is asking people to do, to go beyond the, if you follow me A, B, C, D, E, you'll get 1, 2, 3. I think that's actually quite dangerous, because the irony is that's not self-help, that's being dependent on me. So self-help is about helping yourself. And a lot of self-help books is like, follow me as I'm your leader. And if you didn't do well, it's because you didn't follow me enough as your leader. So we were like, from chapter 1, we're like, no, you're your own leader. You're your own person. All we can do is ask you certain questions and guide you to the rough, point you in the right direction, but we can't take a step for you. We can't know what is the right thing for you to do.
All right, that's a really great approach. And also, I see, looking at some of your work, that you bring sustainability and environmental ethics into that picture as well. How does that fit?
I believe it fits if you have a logocentric view. So if you have the Stoic theology, it's saying, okay, what is it, the one thing we all share? And the Stoics are very clear on this, that even rocks, have an essence of the logos, much less as a ladder as such, with the sage being the top, or the universe being right at the top, the sage being the next one, then us, we're not quite sages, but we're progressing in that direction, and so on and so forth. So the Stoics will say things like, a plant won't bloom until the time is right, until it's reasonable to do so. So a plant, if it's still in survival mode for the Stoics, it won't bloom, because it would be unreasonable. It would be illogical for a plant to do that. So from a very sort of strict theological perspective, we felt that this was a very Stoic idea. The idea, and we used something called the circles of concern, which traditionally has stopped at humanity and gone from a logocentric, so facing the logos or divine reason, or just reason to center, we can recognize that the mathematics of the universe, the science of the universe, and we can bring that in towards us. In terms of animals, for example, we argue that a cow has, we have an obligation to a cow to allow a cow to live according to her nature. And by restricting completely her relationship with her calf, that is going against her nature. So we kind of make these kind of arguments. And we feel that that is being a good citizen. That a good citizen isn't just about looking after a human community, but also going beyond that. Okay, what is reasonable when it comes to the planet? If we want to align ourselves completely with reason, with living according to nature, what does that mean? That's why we kind of felt that it was necessary to extend it in a more contemporary fashion, but really, really rooted in the ancient ideas of the Stoic theology and cosmology.
It's a bit of an innovative approach too, because I guess there's some of the criticisms that people have of the vanilla approach or the orthodox kind of ancient approach is it doesn't really give too much attention to animals, for example.
Yeah, I mean, Martha Nussbaum has said, like, I think it was 1996, like, Stoics don't really do animal welfare. Well, no, the Stoics don't do animal welfare because even a human being doesn't have intrinsic value. It's the reason that we have that has intrinsic value, and only the reason per se. So the fact that we don't have rights in Stoicism, right? It doesn't make sense to say, I have a right to life. Based on what? The Stoic would say, what right do you have? Or I have a right to marry someone. Where did that right come from? For them, there's no sense of this right. So animal welfare, animal rights, doesn't make sense in terms of a Stoic frame. I often say to people, there's no place to put your coat. There's no peg on which to hang such an idea. But they do say that we have obligations. Now, Chrysippus did say things like, the pig was here for us as a form of salt. Right? But then Cleanthes said that ants, and they did argue about it. Cleanthes said, no, ants have reason. I can see them as they go about their daily life. And he had written other things, and it was only whilst he was looking at this anthill that he realized, or he believed himself to be wrong, and reconsidered his position. So it's not as clear cut as people think. And then Musonius Rufus, he says things like one should be vegetarian, that one should not eat meat, one should only drink milk and eat honey. So he's not a vegan as such. Although I wouldn't even say he was vegetarian, because vegetarian is an ethical approach, and there's no definite one must always do something in Stoicism, other than one must always seek virtue and always avoid the vices. Other than that, like being a vegetarian is like, regardless, I'm going to be a vegetarian for normally animal welfare or for health reasons or for other things. But as an ideology, that doesn't fit completely with Stoicism. Stoicism, it always depends. But we felt that there were some things that we could bring in to the Stoic community to consider and say, as a contemporary Stoic, whether you be modern or traditional, what does that mean when you have climate breakdown? What does that mean when you have humongous commercial farms, so not farmers, but commercial farms exploiting the land and animals in the same way? What should our response be as a Stoic? Some people argue, well, doesn't really have a response. I'm like, the Stoicism doesn't work for everything. Like, if Stoicism has no response to some critical issues, then Stoicism doesn't work. Because for me, Stoicism is a life philosophy. It means it must give you answers, or at least, it must give you questions. It must give you a framework with which to ask and to answer everything that you would humanly come up against. I mean, that's what the sage is. The sage is not all knowing, but he or she is incapable of making a moral mistake within the framework of what it means to be human. And for me, like, and Leo and other people increasingly, the planet's problem, for example, in Australia, there was the forest fires. Do we not have responses as Stoic to those kind of issues? My answer is yes, because Stoicism is a framework for life. And that was a life problem. It was a national problem in Australia. It was a very much regional one as well, but it was a national outcry about, should this happen? And why is it happening? What should we do? That was a really long answer, Courtney, so I apologize for that. But
no, it's really interesting.
It's a very good question.
Because obviously that's a really important point. More and more, there tends to be a kind of two tribes forming, especially in the interweb space, like the traditional and the modern. But you're asking a very appropriate question, like, shouldn't Stoicism be the kind of philosophy for modern people that answers modern concerns and can help us deal with modern problems? Maybe it doesn't make it entirely a lot of sense if we stick to merely ancient Roman concerns, for example, you know?
Yeah, I mean, the ancient Romans didn't stick to ancient Greek concerns. So people go, oh, that's just a modern concern. So, well, I'm sorry, but Leonidas, he was really responsible for translating, as it were, some of the Greek ideals into Roman ideals. He didn't say, oh, wait a minute. The Greeks were not concerned with this way of looking at politics, therefore we can't use it. And we still study Machiavelli today, even though Machiavelli's world, for example, was very different. No one says, oh, I shouldn't study Machiavelli if I'm doing political philosophy, because Machiavelli's life was very different. No, it's you take what is useful, you take that frame, right? So in Machiavelli, it's useful if you're not an idealist, you're a realist, and you realize that people are going to go around, they're going to do things that you don't want to do, and you have to respond accordingly. Machiavelli's not talking about an ideal world. He's not, people think he's just, trying to get the best out of everybody. No, he's getting the best out of a difficult situation, like kind of Seneca as well. Seneca didn't restrict himself to classical Greek problems. He couldn't have done, because in Roman period, they often, for example, Cicero and Cato have an argument in the Senate. And when Cato defends a law that Cicero and Cato actually wrote, Cicero attacks him for using Stoicism. And Stoicism is a Greek foreign idea, right? So just to stick to the Greek ideal in the Roman period wouldn't have been helpful, either the Republic or when we have emperors running around. So it's ludicrous to me, at least, to say, oh, we shouldn't be concerned with problems that the Romans didn't deal with, as if the Romans just thought, let's just deal with what the classical Greek city-states had to deal with. That wasn't the political arena that they're walking in. And most of the Romans that we know about who are Stoics or who were influenced by Stoicism are very highly political. They're senators.
Yeah, and it sounds like you're particularly interested in a concern that's especially important and especially pressing, and definitely fits in with the kind of logocentric view that you're talking about. And I guess it's quite a different way of innovating than, say, what the Silicon Valley entrepreneur kind of guys is attempting to do, capitalize on ancient wisdom, for example. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense, and sounds really attractive. And which one did you come to first? Did you come to sustainability first, or did you find sustainability through Stoicism?
So that's a very good question. My background is an environmental engineer. So I usually spend a lot of time, and now I spend like a lot of time between the philosophy department and the engineering department. But previously I was mainly in the engineering department, which is why I think I come at it from a different angle. Like Leonidas is very strong on the ancient fragments. I'm like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do with the ancient fragments? Like, help me, I have this problem, help me solve it. The engineer is always asking how. How do we solve it? What do we do? Not necessarily why. So the philosophy gave me the why. Why would you do something? But I think the engineering approach is also useful. If there is a forest fire, the engineers aren't particularly interested about who's to blame particularly. The engineers are interested in how they can engineer a process so that it doesn't happen again, or it happens in a certain way. So they're not so interested in the ethical aspects. Not to say there's no ethics in engineering, there is, right? But the main thing is, like, we have to have a practical solution to a problem, regardless of someone's political beliefs or ideas or religious ideology, right? So I felt like I was like, okay, I am an engineer. I do have the environmental background. There are some key problems here that I feel that the Stoic philosophy can definitely answer. We're just not approaching it, even though it is a major problem. Doesn't mean it's the only problem. People go, oh, there's more, there's bigger problems than that. There might be. I'm not here to judge about what's the biggest problem and what priority we should have. For example, in COVID, we had a health crisis. But the fact that it is happening is also something we shouldn't just shut our eyes to. So, okay, maybe it's not the most important problem in every single day, but it is a problem. And certainly our days that it's a massive problem. We need to think about it. We need to think about why we're doing it and how we can respond, how we should approach it, and why we do something. And I think Stoicism it's not the only philosophy that can potentially answer those questions. But to me, the reason why we have this disconnect with the environment and humanity is because our lifestyle has taken us away from living according to nature, where Stoicism calls us, like it or not, to live in accordance with nature. So it's really rooted in this nature as a whole and our own nature, to know who we are. And I would say a lot of people as adults forget who they are. So as a kid would, if you told a kid you've got to go and kill like a pig, and they're free, like, no, Pepper the pig, and they wouldn't do it. It's only by disconnecting the reality and saying, do you want a ham sandwich, and not calling it a Pepper Pig sandwich, like kids might eat it, for example. So there's some sense of bringing us back. And I think Stoicism, it's not unique. I'm not going to claim it's unique, but I think it has some very key ideas that starts with taking responsibility for myself, then taking responsibility for, things, well, not taking, but taking as much responsibility as I can for things around me. And, things like people said to me, well, it's beyond my control, this environmental issue. So why should I care? I'm like, well, my mum's beyond my control. My mum does things that I don't want her to do, for example, and vice versa. Should I not care about my mum? So, and it could be that your plastic straw is the one that goes into a turtle's nostril. So it could actually be you that is causing that particular problem. It's very silly. We go, oh, it's beyond your control, don't care. Every single human being is beyond our control except us. We just not care about anybody. Doesn't make any sense.
So I guess, are there any specific things that we can do to, bring the environment or climate change into our circle of care? Are there specific things that we can do that Stoics would be sort of more inclined to than, say, other people?
It's very much to do with your role, Courtney. So the first question is, what is my role? Like, many people don't ask that question. So if you're a father, you have a responsibility, I would argue, as a Stoic, to teach your children in a participatory way about matters linked to the environment. So they know where cheese comes from. They don't think cheese just comes in a silver package that magically appears in a supermarket somewhere with a laughing cow on it, for example. That they know that laughing cow is a cartoon and that there is a real cow that is being milked to produce that cheese, and then find out, how is that cow being milked? Nothing wrong with a cow, but notice how they're, why they're being milked, and what conditions they're in. But as a parent, I do think like you have a responsibility to ensure that your children know something about the environment. Do they know the trees in the neighborhood? Right. I mean, as a kid, I was taught the trees in our primary school, so from the age of 4 to 11 playground. Yeah. Do our kids know trees? Do they know their names? Do they know what lives in there? Do they know that only like trees that are endemic to Australia are important for bird life in Australia? So we can just plant trees that are, let's say they grow only in the US, and then we bring them into Australia. And Australia is a good example of things that get brought over from the UK, and then you have a rabbit population issue and things like that. Do they know why that's caused? But as a parent, you have a specific role. If you're a teacher, you have a role. If you're a mechanic, you have a role. So to tell people, for example, you don't need to replace the gearbox, actually. We could just repair it if you'd like. We can just replace this one piece, right? I know you could make more money replacing the gearbox for them, but, as a Stoic mechanic, you'd be like, is that reasonable? As a chef, you might encourage local ingredients. You might consider portion size so that you reduce waste, for example.
Okay, yeah.
You might have seasonal products as a chef. As a waitress, you might point out like things in your, to the chefs and to management where, maybe there's a waste of napkins. Like, we just keep giving out loads of napkins, for example, where people don't use them. So maybe we can just put them in the center of the restaurant and people can get what they need. So that's just one restaurant. The management might say, okay, well, how often do we have to change the menus? And is there a way of doing it so that we don't cover them with plastic, unless it kind of depends on what kind of restaurant you're running, right? Can we make nicer menus and just change the piece of paper and insert a different piece of paper? Or do we have to completely change the whole menu the whole time? And they might say yes, they might say no. The issue is not if it's a yes or a no, it's the reasons behind why you do it. Right? So, for example, you might say as a hotel, do we need to wash all the towels every day? Can we not encourage the people, which is something that is happening, people to put your towel in this place if you want to keep it, put your towel in the bath if you want to wash it, because before they just used to wash everything. So, that's a hotel example. But it always depends on your role. So, if you're Stoic, it's not that I can give you one answer. It's like, look around you, pay attention, Posidonius here, pay attention to what's going on and make decisions. Use reason to go, how can we make this better? How can we improve things? Can we do things better? The answer is probably, not necessarily, but probably yes. And some things are very simple.
Yeah, that's really great. And obviously it would be good if some of these big tech entrepreneurs could buy into this way of thinking and you know, tailor industry to fit a kind of more rational and logo-centric ethic, I guess, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing I love about Stoicism from this perspective, is that because it's not rights-based, it's obligation-based. So in rights-based, what happens is the powerful people, they give people who are less powerful the right to do something. So let's give an example. In the UK and now in Australia, you know, the straight, not LGBT, government in Australia suddenly decided eventually that people, you know, gay people needed to get married and, you know, to each other, and that should happen. So a powerful group of people, i.e. the government, decides that a smaller group of people, generally speaking, than the majority of people at the moment, like this could change, but at the moment most people are, you know, heterosexual couples, needed to have rights. The Stoics are like, well, why did they suddenly have the right now, but they didn't have the right 10 years ago? What's the difference? Like, really, they have obligations. So the most powerful people on the planet have the most obligation. So that would put Silicon Valley, instead of giving people rights to do something through, say, Twitter, or like, now you can edit your Twitter button, right? Like, they go, well, I actually have the greatest obligation. I have to do more, So as a parent, you have a bigger obligation than someone who doesn't have kids, right? So even if I teach your kids in my classroom, you have a great obligation, because you have more power to influence or you should have, or normally have, more influence over your own child. So it really is obligation based. And yes, I think Silicon Valley could ask some key questions, like, do we really need Bitcoin, considering the carbon emissions produced by servers in China that use brown coal to allow very rapid, safe transactions? Do we need that? To what extent do we need that? If we're going to do that, can we not use hydropower so at least it's cleaner electricity? That kind of thing. So I honestly wish that Silicon Valley Stoics, as Leo and I coined them, really considered, we have such an impact on society, what can we do to improve it, rather than potentially create Stoicism in the image of their view of Marcus Aurelius and Seneca, so they can maintain their power and their wealth without questioning whether that's reasonable or not, and to what extent it's reasonable. Because Stoics don't say that there should not be inequality. They just question at what point is that inequality unjust, and when it becomes unjust, why is it unjust, and what can we do about it? For example,
it's interesting to take that approach too, emphasizing duty and obligation, as opposed to, say, what tends to get reinforced is this idea of more of a cynical approach, a minimalistic giving up of things. So rather than say, well, you should give up on this, or you shouldn't have that extra coffee, or you should, you know, instead there's this idea of obligation. And probably in the background, as you said, some people have more power than other people and therefore more obligations. And probably people like you and me who live in, you know, wealthy countries and enjoy a high standard of living have a greater obligation to the environment and those sort of things than others.
Absolutely, that's correct. So yeah, we have it's like you have wealthy, but I often say in the developing world, not everybody in the developing world is poor. In fact, there are a lot of wealthy people in the developing world. So it's not because of one's nationality, but it's certainly one's influence, one's level of comfort in terms of economics, because you could be an Australian, you could be dirt poor, right? Doesn't, there are many people in the outback that would be poor, and they would be poorer than a wealthy CEO in Brazil who's got a helicopter. So it's not a case of nationality, but certainly a case of what's my position, what can I do, what's my network, how easy is it for a wealthier person to make a phone call and make a change. And perhaps if they didn't lobby against whatever is against their best interest, what they think their best interest, and work on the best interests of the whole, we would have a different world. And that's not to say that Stoics are communist, which is obviously they wouldn't be, because that's a newer concept. or socialist, again, that's a newer concept, but certainly they would question like, to at what point does something become unjust and why does it become unjust? And like, for example, I love when people tell me, having a cold shower is Stoic. Well, it depends. In Stoicism, it depends why you're having a cold shower. Are you having a cold shower to be disciplined? Discipline per se is not Stoicism. I can be disciplined and refuse to speak to my wife. But no, she upset me. I'm not speaking to her for 24 hours. Right? How disciplined am I? Look at my Stoicism, right? So it's not that discipline per se is Stoic. It's why you're being disciplined. So if you had a cold shower because your wife wanted a hot one and you only had enough water in the tank for one person, you could make the argument that is a Stoic thing to do, to give up for the benefit of somebody else, for the benefit of the community. But to say you just stand there butt naked because you want to be disciplined, I often say, if you want to practice being cold in the soup kitchen. There's other ways you can practice being cold. People say that's really, really, really difficult to stand and be cold in the shower. Yeah, it's not easy, but there are other things that are harder. Giving up if you're 23 years old, giving up half your Sundays of going out, doing whatever you want to help other people. That's also hard. So it's not a measure of just because it's hard, it's therefore worthwhile. There are a lot of things that are hard. What makes it worthwhile in Stoicism is that you are being better for yourself and for other people. So I'm like, what is it? If you're just being cold in the shower, how are you benefiting the cosmos?
That's
now,
right.
You might have really good reasons, but often it's like, well, I'm just practicing discipline. Do 100 push-ups then, same discipline. What are the push-ups for? Is that Stoic? Well, I'll say yes, because I'm practicing discipline. Again, are you doing push-ups so that you can, I don't know, help people up the mountain? Are you doing push-ups so that you can, defend your family if something bad happens? Or are you just doing push-ups because you want big biceps? It depends on why you're doing it. Stoicism is always like, well, why are you doing it? What's your reason? That's what makes it Stoic. It's not that showers per se are Stoic or unstoic. In the sense of reading a book is Stoic or unstoic. What are you reading? Why are you reading it? Not all books are equal, right? Same thing.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and it's something that I'm quite interested in, because I come at this from, as you're interested in the sustainability, I'm quite interested in psychology, and it tends to always slip into this kind of modern spiritual ascesis of minimalism and self-discipline. And I agree with you. I think it's really a conversation about that we're a part of a whole, and the whole is a much larger community, and somehow we have to find ways to be more effective and useful and maximize our obligations in larger and larger spheres. And I think it's really refreshing to see someone trying to, use their understanding and the rational component that's pointed out in Stoicism, and try to find ways in which it makes sense to modernize it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think there's I'm all for modernizing aspects as long as we have the framework intact. So people might say to me things like, atheism is modernization. The thing is, if you read, every time you read like God or something linked to God or divine, and you get a black pen, you don't have much left in Stoicism. And when I speak to other colleagues and my academic colleagues, they're like, but you don't have ethics if you don't have got the whole of the Stoic ethics is based on the fact there's a benevolent being, right? Not the Abrahamic gods, so not Jesus, not Buddha, not any other prophet you could name. But there is a need for a benevolent being, because that's the reason they give to why we should try to strive for virtue. And then people say, oh, well, you don't need God. I'm like, okay, so prove to me why virtue is the only good. How are you going to prove it? You can't prove it to me. That's an axiomatic claim. So that's a claim. That's where you pitched your tent. And from that point of pitching one's tent, that's where you go, okay, I believe that virtue is the only good, right? And therefore, I'm then going to do X, Y, and Z in order to live a life and try to achieve eudaimonia. But removing the Stoic God doesn't remove the issue of needing to have belief, have a faith, right? So people say to me, well, I can prove to you that virtue is the only good in the Stoic framework. And I say, okay, prove to me that Stoic framework is the framework that you should use. You can't, it's just an infinite regress.
Yeah.
But the opinion the Stoics had is this is the reason why virtue is the only good. If you remove that, I really believe that it's like saying Jesus Christ isn't important in Christianity. Yeah. But does that mean you can't be a Christian and not, and believe in Jesus Christ? Well, it's very hard for me as an academic to sort of sit there and go, you don't believe that Jesus was the Son of God, and you don't believe he died on the cross, and you don't believe he cleansed you of your sins. Are you sure you're not Jewish? That would be the kind of question that I would ask. And then people say, yeah, but then you're telling me I can't be Stoic. And I often reply things like, why are you so attached to a label? It's a label at the end of the day, and there's certain things that label means to the ancient Stoics, and they would be very surprised that people were trying to remove the divine approach and then still call it Stoicism. Again, like, it's not for me to tell it's not for me to say who is a Stoic based on how much they really integrate Stoic framework into their lives. As an academic, though, it is for me to point out, again, my role, where it breaks down because of the Stoic text. Again, that doesn't mean that Stoicism, if you have an atheistic approach, isn't useful. It just means it isn't coherent and consistent, which is contradictory to what the Stoics try to do. Again, maybe people say that's very academic, but as an academic, that's my job. If you're a mechanic and you say, well, you don't need this to make the car work, but if you remove it, it's not going to work very well. But yeah, does it mean that you're the worst driver in the world? It just means that your car doesn't work very well.
Yeah. And it does come across as quite a schism in Stoicism if you think that they really are focused on coherence and logical coherence through and through and through.
Absolutely.
So as soon as you start to weaken the fabric of their arguments, you're actually doing something rather ironic.
It is ironic. I'm glad you've identified that. It's so ironic, it's funny. I find it funny, and academics, like here in Cambridge, they'll laugh as well and go, what? Like, they're just like, that doesn't make sense. Like, it doesn't make sense. Again, like, if people are influenced by Stoic ideas, that's no problem to me. Like, I don't have an issue with people claiming to be Stoic, right? That's up to them. I don't have an issue with people being atheistic Stoics. That's up to them. My job, though, is just to point out that where you need consistency in Stoicism, this is fundamental. Because without this ability, Stoicism, again, doesn't work. So you can be Epicurean and argue things like you don't need a benevolent God, and you can be Aristotelian. So speaking with other academics, we were talking about Jenga, and it was like, the piece gets taken away, and I think you were there. So the piece gets taken away in Stoicism, the divine piece, and it falls flat literally within about 5 seconds, because Aristotle wouldn't fall flat quite that quickly, and Epicurus wouldn't fall flat that quickly. So it just surprises me that people feel the need to cling on to a label, whilst simultaneously saying that the key fundamentals of why Stoics claim something are unimportant.
It's very peculiar, and I wonder why they do it too. But I think the problem is mirrored in psychology. I think I mentioned that last time, because without normative standards for certain kinds of thinking or being in the world, without some normative standard by which you can measure action or thought, it's just relativism. We don't know why we're doing what we're doing.
Correct.
And Stoicism fundamentally, as you're saying, is a really coherent philosophy that makes your own individual part in accord with a much larger kind of part, which is kind of aggregations of spheres of contact, and you're to make yourself as much like that as possible, as much like that regularity and order and principle. And without that standard, the normative standard, obviously, we're sort of alienated, and we've made ourselves to be a kind of tumor. I think there's a quote in Marcus Aurelius there about, making oneself a tumor to the cosmos.
I think it says a lot more about us when we feel the need to remove something so fundamental and still cling on to a label. And I know people are going to get upset about that, and they're going to go, yeah, but who are you to tell me? Well, I'm not telling you what to believe. I'm just saying, like, this is the framework you say you adhere to. And the Socratic dialectic, which is the method of choice by the Stoics, causes me to ask you why you feel that need. And it does talk, I think there's a real cognitive dissonance with this. A lot of people have lost their faith, and they come to Stoicism thinking that, it's great. I can do everything, I can keep my virtue, what I thought was virtue ethics and my ethical stance without God. The irony is the reason why religious people are so attracted to the very black and white virtue or vice is precisely because there's a God, right? That's why I think it's such an easy transformation for a, say, Christian, and not necessarily only a Christian, but for a Christian to jump into Stoic ethics, because Stoic ethics have been so important to Christian ethics. Right? Yeah. So I find it really funny, and they get really sort of upset when they say, "No, I'm an atheist, and Stoicism has been my savior." Kind of language been my savior, and I don't want to put God back in. I'm like, who said that Christians should have monopoly on the word God? I'm not willing to give up a word the Stoics themselves used, just because it upsets people. Again, because that doesn't mean you have to use it. I mean, that's how people's choices about what words they use. But I'm just not willing to give certain people a monopoly over a very powerful word, whether that be God, divine, logos, reason, anything like that. And again, I think it says, and you have to tell me, but I think it says more about the person who's really upset about it than it does about the framework itself. But you're the psychologist, so I'll ask you, why do you think people feel the need to remove a fundamental part of the equation, because Stoicism is very logical, and then still attach themselves to a label and fight for a label which they have kind of took the stitching out of, as it were?
Well, first, I'm not a psychologist. I studied psychology. I'm not allowed to claim that title. But I think, people who are really interested in Stoicism, it feels like for them that it's a new fad, right? It's only been around 20 or 30 years, it feels like, to most people. And it's, in some respects, closely aligned with cognitive science, cognitive behavioral therapy and things like that. So people kind of think, oh, this is hip, it's evolutionary psychology, or it's the latest form of cognitive science, but it has all the stuff that the ancient kind of philosophy brings with it. But yeah, and I think probably those people online, the Josh Rogans and the Jordan Petersons and those sort of characters, not passing any criticism on any of those guys, but obviously they've made philosophy really hip and fashionable, and everybody wants to get involved, which is great, because I mean, this is for the Brisbane Stoics, for example. So we all sit around under a tree and talk about these sort of ideas, and that's wonderful. But there is a point, and I think this is the point of your project too, where you have to seriously sort through the wheat and take out the chaff and kind of look at it and go, well, I can't actually alter the composition of this material without it not being what it actually is supposed to be. And if I keep it intact in this kind of a way, it will still allow me to act as an ethical agent in the universe and do the kind of things that you're talking about, Kai, like be interested in sustainability and living a better life and being a better person, being a better father, being a better human being. It's just there's a boogeyman there, isn't it? And it's the shadow of God that Nietzsche talks about, for example, that we still tiptoe around the grave of our God. We're afraid that we might disturb his eternal rest or something and be haunted.
I think you're right. I mean, Jack Wisnett, who came up with the Jenga idea, I think, claim that too. I just find it very interesting, because people have been pointing when we have Stoic books that are atheistic, but I also point out that Lawrence Becker's book was A New Stoicism. It was peer reviewed, but he didn't claim it to be Stoicism. And the other books where people claim that it's atheistic are not peer reviewed. So it means, when I say peer reviewed, I mean academics haven't looked at those arguments and then critiqued them. So people don't realize that when you write an academic paper, it goes through people don't always realize it goes through various reviews. So if you claim, for example, to an academic at Cambridge that the Stoics don't rely on God at all, they're going to have 30 years of experience going, wait a minute, what are you reading? You're obviously not reading what everybody else is reading in myself. Whereas if you publish, like in Being Better, for example, we didn't go for a peer-reviewed paper process. we did do papers, Leonidas and I. So that's one of my challenges when I hear that people claim that we can be atheistic. I then ask them, where's your peer-reviewed paper? Where have you written a peer-reviewed paper on this subject? Yeah. And I've yet to have an answer, because the answer is that no one has written except Leonidas and us in terms of those books that claim to be atheistic. There are other people that claim that Stoicism is fundamentally has a theological aspect, or at least a pantheistic. So like John Sellers will claim those kind of things. And John Sellers has been peer reviewed. His books have been peer reviewed. His articles are peer reviewed. When he does presentations in front of academics, you can't get away with saying things that you can say to the general public. And I think, again, that's part of my role. And I say to people, don't just accept what I say based on the fact that I have a PhD. There's just a PH and a D. It doesn't mean anything other than I've studied something for a certain period of time. But go and look yourself. Go and look at what A.A. Long says, Chris Gill says, John Sellers says, William Stevens says, Leonidas Konstantikos in his own right says. Don't just believe what I say, which is why I like Chris Fisher's approach, the Stoicism on Fire podcast. He's always saying, go back to text. I go back to text. I've never read anything from an academic that is held in esteem to claim those things. Again, there's nothing wrong with saying that we could perhaps forge a path that is atheistic. I believe you could argue that, and that's fine. I don't have an issue with that. But to say that Stoicism, at the moment, Stoicism works without the theology, that's not, I haven't seen the evidence to show that's true. It would be nice to see if someone could do it. And Lawrence Becker tried to do it, but I think he came through the Hume distinction, fact value distinction. Just because something is a fact doesn't mean that we should value or we should do something. So I give the example of, if you have an SUV, you're going to produce carbon emissions. Then you're going to cause this planet to deteriorate a little bit, but you are contributing to that. If you live in Australia and you have a kid and she needs that car to get to school, you have to make a choice. As a father, you have an obligation to your daughter that no one else has, or your wife also has, right? Or your ex-wife, or whoever your ex-partner has, her mother has, or her stepmom has. But very few people have that obligation. Now, you might sell your car in the future, but it's, if it's Tuesday morning, you can't sell your car right now. You have to make a choice. So which fact do you want to pay attention to? The facts won't tell you. And as Leonidas would say, as he's been has fought in Iraq, you don't have all the facts. It's rare that you have all the facts. You can't live according to facts. This is a claim that's been made. You can't do it because you just don't have them all. And even if you have them, like the two facts I have here, doesn't tell me, should I be a good father today or should I be a good citizen? On some level, some people might say good citizen. Surely not giving my kid an education also makes me a bad citizen, right? Sure, it's just, from a generic, from a non-Stoic point of view, bad, right? So people say, well, you're being a bad father and you have to be a good father, and that's part of being a good citizen, surely. So those two facts, they contradict each other. Which fact do you want to hold on to? So I haven't seen anything that has the academic rigor that would allow Stoicism as it stands to be an atheistic approach. I'd like to see it. I'd like to review a paper. I'd like to be, invited to review a paper on that. And I'd like to see the logic that they would bring to that, but I haven't seen it yet, and nor have my colleagues.
Yeah, and it seems as if you read it, as I read it at least, with a kind of psychotherapeutic kind of bent in mind, you keep finding these Stoic kind of normative attitudes that are required to live a good life, and they are inherently pious. They're feelings of deep gratitude that the world was made to fit with that, for example, and feelings of being a part of a whole gives you a sense of, as you said, obligation and connection. So there's something about the immanent God in the picture that creates a certain attitude in the person who wants to live according to virtue. And I agree. I mean, I'm not an academic, but I read people like Christopher Gill and Nussbaum and Sellers, of course, to get, as well as the old text, to get a clearer picture. I mean, I try not to, again, I should be careful. I mean, read what you want, but I tend to steer away from what you would call modern, or what's the word? I don't want to say frivolous, the kind of Stoicism that's designed to sell books.
Yeah, maybe the more self-helpy kind of
Self-helpy, that's a good
or
word. Yeah.
minimalist. You can call it even minimalist Stoicism, and then
Yeah.
Brad Inwood calls it kind of, and again, he's another. I know he calls it minimalist Stoicism, and I don't have an issue with that. Like, if you're a minimalist Stoic, like, it's not to say that it's not valid in your life and it's not useful. And if cold showers have helped you become disciplined and become a better father indirectly because of that, then that's great. But you don't need to claim it to be Stoic. It's just it could be a good practice for you.
But one thing that gets me talking to people who are interested in Stoicism is there is a kind of fear factor in that they say, well, I find it really hard to read Martha Nussbaum. They'll say it makes my eyes bleed or something, or I can't read blah, blah, blah because it's too hard. And I don't know if I believe that, because yes, I have an education, that's true. So I have a certain advantage, but I think if you're really interested and you really want to follow it through, you're just going to have to break through that barrier and read some of the actual academic work in the area, unfortunately. Especially if you want to, as you say, put forward a detailed argument why you think, Stoicism should be this way or that way.
Yeah. I mean, it can be hard to access, which is why we did Being Better. And I think the second book is much more rigorous, not academic, but rigorous, because the first one was on the little pinky toe in the water to see if we could bring in academic concepts that weren't just for example, friendship. People say, be a good friend, but Stoics are really clear about what friendship means. And only the sage can really be a true friend. Those kind of concepts, they don't translate well to self-help unless you carefully think about it, which is why book 2 required us to go, okay, how can we push people along a little bit, encourage them, but not be so superficial as to, if you have a cold shower and you only have 1 sugar in your coffee, and that's Stoicism. So Being Better, we did try to do that. We did try to make it accessible, but you're not going to get the rigor that you get when we, Leah and I write papers. You're not going to get that. Though I would say, we're very blessed or lucky because we have YouTube. So even A.A. Long, Chris Gill, I've spoke with Chris Gill and been interviewed alongside him. They will tell you these things in a much more relaxed way on a YouTube video. So people say, I can't access Chris Gill's work academically speaking, but they haven't even listened to a YouTube interview with him. They haven't listened to StoicCon 2018 where I spoke, for example. A.A. Long spoke as well, and we're saying very similar things, which is then why he then mentored me, helped me, because he said I can see that kind of thinking too. And he was just making a point again as an academic that this, according to nature, means something beyond an atheistic approach. And I wouldn't say that he identifies as a Stoic. He certainly never said that publicly, and I have no reason to believe that he would identify as a Stoic. But again, it's like when I've spoken to other academics recently, they said, I just want Stoicism to be got right. I don't see myself as a Stoic. They tell me, but I want people to understand it correctly. They say I'm very strange for them as an academic, because they say, you are very strange because you actually live Stoicism. That's really odd. So I'm an unusual academic. I'm not the only academic, but it is unusual. But I would say that people that told me that, they haven't even done the YouTube videos.
Yeah. I was going to ask you about that too. I was going to say, you don't meet a lot of academics that actually take on the philosophy as a way of life. So does that create any tension with people, or in your...
For the academic world, yes, because they want you to be there's something about being aloof from what you're looking at, which is valued in the modern ivory tower. And so, from the ivory tower perspective, the Achilles heel of Stoicism is the fact that it has a God, and is the fact that it's objective. Now, I'm not saying that I think it's an Achilles heel. Actually, I think it's a strength. But for them, it's just really odd that someone would work at Stoicism in order to be able to participate in society in a certain way and to make the world a better place. That they like that, they think that's superb, but it's not something that they see that they ever thought was useful. I remember one of the people who did a review of one of our papers said, but this is not even relevant. You're talking as if Stoicism is alive and well. It's been dead for 2,000 years. I was like, what? Just, and I was like, actually, I have to highlight the fact that people are actually call themselves Stoic and do try to live according to this framework. Academics can't believe it. So the tension isn't from in my personal life, but as a professional, people find it really odd. And they say, well, why would you do? They said to me, why would you do that to yourself? You have to tie yourself in academic knots to live that life, right? You have to accept things that, as an academic, I find unacceptable. Right? As in, like, you have to agree there's a benevolent, divine being, which we could call God, or we could call something else, Zeus, for example. And they find it really interesting that one would just have to do that, tie themselves to philosophy. And I said, well, you know, for me, Stoicism, if you're going to really do Stoic philosophy, you live it. I don't think Epictetus was just doing it for academic reasons, and then that smile comes across as because they're nodding and they know. They're like, yeah, that's true. If you're just going to do Stoic philosophy, because these people don't always just do Stoic philosophy, and that's the only thing that I do in terms of the ancient philosophies, at least. Environmental ethics, a little bit other things, but again, that's very academic. It's not really my life.
Yeah.
They find that really interesting, and that smile always comes across, and they go, "You're just really, really interesting, and you want to get it right, and you're not just picking and choosing, cherry picking. Stoicism that works for your life. You're actually making your life harder by not cherry picking." So I find that quite endearing. People tell me that, and they tell me that often. Yeah.
It is really interesting, and I also wonder, would people have the same sort of problem studying philosophy in the theological department? Like, I think they get a bit more of a free pass. You can read people like Gillich and so on, and you can be an existentialist and a Christian. You know, you can be a phenomenological Christian, for example.
You can. So yeah, in divinity colleges or theological departments, yes. But in the classics, where that's the other thing, people don't realize that academically there's a difference between philosophers and classicists. So, for example, Massimo Pilucci is a philosopher, but he's not a classicist. He's not trained in ancient Greek and Latin, and that's why he hasn't written papers that have been peer reviewed by people who I would say are incredibly knowledgeable in the ancient texts.
Mm-hmm.
That's the key thing that people don't realize is a distinction. So why do I have these people as mentors? Because I realize I don't have the classicist training. Leonidas gave me the philosophical training, and William Stevens as well. John Taylor's a little bit, but I really needed to spend time with, like, having a drink with Malcolm Schofield a few weeks ago, because he talked about the ideal city and Zeno. So his most famous contribution is what is the ideal city like for Stoics. And he started developing Stoicism in a contemporary sense in the academic world because it was dead in the 1980s. So, like in the UK, at least, it goes back all the way then, because it was only really Chris Gill and A.A. Long that were working on these matters. So they started saying, no, we really need to develop this further. But people don't realize that this distinction exists and why the training is what it is. So Aldo Danucci, for example, an excellent Brazilian scholar who's translating currently for Penguin in Brazil, Epictetus from ancient Greek to Portuguese. And again, then I'll say to him things like, tell me the exact, because I speak Portuguese and his English is good in this area, like, tell me exactly what that word says. I want to know exactly what they're saying, right? And again, if you don't have that training, or you don't seek out people who have that training, you can come into, in my opinion, a slightly different interpretation, which is not the classic interpretation.
Yeah.
And I think that it doesn't mean that one can't do that, but one must be careful.
Right.
When one.
And I guess thankfully the issue around what is up to us, what is up to me is one of these classic problems that has really become a endemic kind of an issue in some forms of interpretation in Stoicism, right?
Yes.
It's being called the dichotomy of control, for example, as opposed to whatever else seems to be indicated by it.
For example, and then you even had in some people claiming there's a trichotomy of control. And then I think Maulin, who has recently passed, put it best. Do you really think Epictetus wasn't aware that within some aspects of your life, there are aspects you can control and that are slightly in your control? If they're slightly in your control, they're still not completely in your control. In the same way that eudaimonia, like we say this in being better, you're either in Miami or you're not. If you're near Miami, you're not in it. So if it's in your control, it's in your control. And if it's nearly in your control, it's not in your control.
Yeah.
It's that simple. There's no trichotomy there. Stoics are black and white on that.
Yeah.
So there was no need to go, appetites wouldn't have gone like, yeah, you know what? There's some things that, feel like they're in my control. So it's like a trichotomy. No, it'd be like, well, they're not. Is it your thoughts? Is it your actions? Is it your attitude? No, then it's not in your control. End of story. Like, that's it. Done, dusted. And that, again, is lack of classicist training. Like, just a very clear, that's why I try not to use the dichotomy of control, especially in academic texts, but really like what is up to us. Because that's what the text they use. People say to me things like, isn't that fundamentalist? Well, I don't know, like checking what the texts actually say. I don't think that's fundamentalist. I think that's called doing your homework.
Yes.
If I walk around and think Sydney is the capital of Australia, I'm really wrong. And I can't be like, wow, how conservative of you to actually find out what the capital is. That doesn't make sense to me. I mean, just because you can say this is what they said, now what we're going to do about it. And that's where you become a fundamentalist or not. It's not pretending that the texts don't say what they say and say, well, I want to innovate. Well, you can innovate. And Seneca says this, right? But he doesn't say, he says there are, people, the people before us are our guides, not our masters. But just before that sentence, the one that gets quoted all the time, is once you know Stoicism, once you've had the training, then and only then, there are guides and not our masters. It's not like you can turn up and go, you know what, I think we should have 5 virtues.
Yeah.
Because then I go, well, why don't you just throw out everything then and make it whatever you want, and then you have a river to visit. So it's just like read the sentence before that, and you'll see the context in which that sentence is. And again, like people have criticized, and academically speaking, like the circles of concern that we added the environment, and they say you really need to tie that back to oikeiosis. And that's true. It is Stoic, but it's not rigorous enough. Like your claims feel Stoic, it does feel Stoic. I would suggest it is a Stoic sort of principle, but it's not tied enough. It's not logically tied enough to the principle of man. I'm like, I need about 6 months to sort that out. So in book 2, that's also something that we're looking at. Like, okay, we really need to tie this to oikeiosis because it's also about what is appropriate and how that happens. I have just said that criticism, that it's not rigorous enough. It's not enough to just draw a circle and then discuss why you think it is the case. You really have to tie it in. Because Stoics are very strong about that. It has to be all connected. It can't be loosely connected. It has to go right into the core. And so the logocentric part is the theological part, but it's also, we need to leave the logic. We need to go through that more in a systematic way. And we haven't done that.
That's really interesting. I think like you say, the oikeiosis part is a fascinating part and a very central part of the Stoic doctrine, and probably very difficult for most people to get their head around because there's not a lot of material on it, is there? There's Cicero and a couple of fragments, but yeah, it'd be awesome if you can unpack that and link it to your current project. That'd be something really.
Yeah, that's what we're doing in book 2. And one interesting little I can tell you is that people say things like, with your circles of concern, you can just push people out. They come into your life, you can push them out. No, you can't. And that's why the Stoics are very clear about friendship. So for example, if you are married, let's imagine you have a wife. She doesn't become your friend when you get divorced from a Stoic point of view. She becomes your ex-wife, right? And she can never be your friend in the true sense, right? Only your friend. She can be a friend and your ex-wife, but she's always going to be your ex-wife, and there's nothing you can do about it. You go, but she's just my friend now. She means no, because you have a kid, because you have memories, because you have a legal document, because there are things that you did as a husband and wife that you cannot undo. So you can't push your ex-wife out of the circle into the friend circle, because she's still not a friend. She's still closer than any of your friends have ever been, unless you've married other friends. So assuming you haven't married any other friend of yours, she's closer to you, whether you like it or not, historically speaking at least, to any friend you could ever have, because that's the distinction. So people are like, oh no, she's just a friend now, we can push her back out. Stoics, you can't do that. The only way that she moves out is that she takes herself out, because it's out of your control. But people don't like that very much. Oh, well, my father's absent, he's never been around. Yeah, but he's still your father. Biologically speaking, he's still your father. And as Epictetus said, nature gives you a father, nature doesn't necessarily give you a good one. So again, your father can't be your friend. Your father can't be a stranger. Right? He's a stranger to me. Well, in a strictly Stoic sense, no, he's not, because he's your father. So he's closer to you than any stranger can be. whether I like that or not, whether you like that or not. So I think the Stoics are really clear about how we need to be careful about how far we bring, when we bring people in, what exactly that means. Because even when you've got a friend and if you and I become really good friends and we have an argument, we decide not to be friends anymore, we're still closer than we are as we would be if we were complete strangers. And so the Stoics are very clear on this. So this is something also we're developing in book 2. I think it's really interesting that, we want to think like, in Stoic, oh yeah, we push people in, they come in our lives and they go out again. The Stoics are like, well,
you're right. And I think that there are ideas in Stoicism that you're exploring there that a lot of modern individualistic kind of ways of thinking would find hard to accept or uncomfortable truths, because we like to think that people are interchangeable. I've had enough of you, I'll get a new one, kind of thing.
Yeah, for example. And you can get a new one, but that you're still gonna have a tie to your ex-wife or your girlfriend. It's not the marriage necessarily that makes it a tie, but that is a tie that you wouldn't have even with a girlfriend. Even if you had a kid with your girlfriend, you still have a tie with your ex-wife that you don't have with her. And so the Stoics, again, it's very about the communal sense, knowing your role. And, that doesn't mean that it's, once your wife's your ex-wife, you shouldn't treat her like your wife, right?
Yeah.
Because she's your ex-wife. But you shouldn't, or necessarily, depending on where you're at, especially if you've married somebody else. But you can't treat her only as a friend. You just can't. No matter what, you can do your best to, you can be as close to a friend, but you're still going to say, you still have to go, I've seen this person naked. I've seen this person naked and I've done things with this person that I wouldn't do with my friend.
Yeah.
I've never done with my male friend, for example, right? I just wouldn't do it with my male friend. So there's this closeness. And so the Stoics are very clear on this, again, this connection, this link, this divine reason. We're all linked in a certain way, and we bring people in. The Stoics are always asking us to bring people closer and to act appropriately. So it is appropriate if you're a father of a person to treat them in a certain way. And it's inappropriate for me to treat your kids in the same way that you do, obviously, right? So the Stoics are clear on these things. And I think this is actually really calling us, like you just mentioned, to be communal and to consider exactly our role in a much wider scope.
Yeah. And
again, this then brings into what cannot be good for the what isn't good for the beehive can't be good for the bee.
Yeah.
Right? This is exactly that. I think it also calls us to be careful about who we marry, for example, or who we accept as friends. Because if you go, I marry that person just because I find them good looking, then you, as a Stoic, you've got to live with that for the rest of your life. Even if you get divorced, you still got to live with that reality, and you are changed by that reality. Heraclitus going to a river. The river changes you. You change the river, and you're not the same person who goes in and out because the river's not the same, but you're not the same. So the Stoics, these connections are very powerful. So to remove the divinity, you remove the connections.
Yeah.
For me, the circles of concern don't make sense, because why would you have them in the way that they are represented? There's no divinity. There's no bringing in closer from the Stoic point of view.
It's really exciting. I'm looking forward to hearing more about that. I guess I don't want to keep you up all night, but the other thing is, I was wondering, so what's going to happen in the future? What are you working on? I mean, you've given us some ideas, but you're in the walled garden. Do you want to say anything about that, or what's going to happen
next? Well, the walled garden, from as I said, has been actually extremely helpful for me. So the walled garden is something I do with Sharon Bell, Simon Drew, predominantly. There are others as well. And we enjoy the participation of people. They come along to our talks and our interviews with people, because we felt the need to not just have a podcast and talk to people and then publish it, but to invite people in to ask questions that we ourselves can't think of. And to me, then that's when I get to know what people really think. And that's really helpful, where the mistakes are, where the logic breaks down, where people find it difficult, like, how dare you say that my ex-husband is still my ex-husband and he can't just be a stranger to me. But you get to sort of feel the pulse. I think it's also important because in the walled garden, we're trying to build the same sort of sense of community, that people can pop in and out, have a chat, identify some of the issues they may have, some of the challenges that they're going through, even on a personal level, like, people ask email, what do I do? My dad's really sick. Right? And I'm like, well, your dad, so let's go through what you think you might do, because I don't know your dad. So, and this really helps us to sort of identify some key challenges, but also communal challenges. Like, we are trying to highlight the importance of the divine there's the tradition, the wisdom traditions, the sense of wonder. I mean, I think Stoicism is really beautiful, and it's like this absolute sense of wonder that you lose when you just shut your eyes to it. And again, it's not about uncritically just accepting everything the Stoics have to say, right? But it's saying like, what's wrong with a bit of wonder? What's wrong with that sense? And that's what we're trying to establish. Because for too long, in my opinion, there's just been this sort of agnostic, atheistic interpretation, which is fine if it aligned with what the Stoics actually said. The problem is, in my view, and a lot of academics' view, it doesn't. So it's not kind of, we're not rescuing it. I think we're just uncovering what is already obvious to those who pass the text. So, you know, I'm really grateful to you, Courtney, for like being there and like keeping me on my toes and getting me to think, challenging my ideas and pointing out where I'm wrong. Because that's the other thing I like about the Walk is that people point out things where I'm wrong. And then I can say, yeah, I'm wrong. And yes, I've been thinking about it. And you know, last week you said this and you're right. And now, you know, I've changed my view. And I think that's unusual for an academic. Most academics don't like doing that. But I can't become a better human being if I think I'm right all the time. Yeah. I think I become a very dangerous human being. So yeah, that's part of the walled garden. And I'm also the associate editor for the Stoic Gym magazine. So that's a magazine that's freely available to anybody who subscribes to it, where we, you know, pick a theme, and we have some really key writers in the contemporary Stoic movement. Predominantly modern Stoicism is quite a secular magazine, but I think again it's nice to bring people in and say this is what Stoicism can offer you, but it's not as philosophically rigorous as say the Walled Garden is. But that's another thing that I'm doing. Whereas I feel like the best thing we can do is to build community and build it together and work out together what is the role. And if anybody in the Brisbane Stoics wants to write an article for the Stoic Gym, please email me. So you can ask them, they can find me at stoickai.com and you can leave me a message, and then we can talk about maybe if you want to write an article. So if anybody wants to write an article for the magazine, I am hunting contributions, contributions, so that would be lovely. If you want to write an article for me, be my guest as well. I'll talk to you about the guidelines and stuff via email. But yeah, if you want to write for the Stoic Gym magazine, let me know, because that's my job in that magazine.
Well, that's great. That's awesome. And you know what? This has been a really good conversation. I've really enjoyed it. And you have a great vibe. So that's really warm and refreshing. And I mean, I've been around a lot of academics before, and I really like how open and genuinely interested you are in Stoicism and other people, and in making this accessible. So thanks a lot. That's wonderful, Kai.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm very grateful. You make it possible for me in ways I can't do. I can't make it accessible without people like you. I mean, that's the truth of the matter.
Yeah, this is really great. All right, I'm just going to stop the recording now, and we at the Brisbane Stoics are just really grateful. Thanks very much.
Thank you.